Tonight's webinar is a journey through time, the evolution of AAUW. I'm very excited to have two wonderful panelists with us tonight. My name is Shannon Wolf. I'm the Managing Director and Chief of Staff of the AAUW National Office. And I'm also honored to work with the Inclusion and Equity Committee as the staff liaison. And the Inclusion and Equity Committee is the group that's hosting tonight's webinar. Our panelists today, I'm so excited to introduce to you. I work closely with both of these really remarkable women, and I'm excited to introduce to you Dr. Melissa LeDuc. Melissa chairs the National Inclusion and Equity Committee and earned her PhD in Curriculum and Instruction from Texas Tech University. She also has a BA in Chemistry from Hawaii Pacific University and a Master's in Chemistry from the University of Dayton. Melissa is currently a faculty member at National Intelligence University and has been with the U.S. Air Force since 2005 and held instructor and faculty positions within the U.S. Air Force Academy, U.S. Air Force Reserve Officer Training Corps, Global School for Professional Military Education, and Squadron Officer School. Melissa is a member of the Literary Research Association and International Society for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. Welcome, Melissa, and thank you for being with us tonight. Next up, we have Jessica Miller. Jessica has been the archivist for the AAUW National Office for the last 3 years. She spent her career working in archival and museum settings, including the National Archives, Historic New England, and Glenstone Museum. She has a master's degree in American history and focuses her work on highlighting the accomplishments and influence of women in American history. I work closely with Jessica at the National Office, and I'm so delighted to have her here tonight and be able to highlight her work as well. So welcome, Jessica. For the members joining us today, I do hope you've had a chance to look at the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Toolkit on our website. There were a lot of questions from the registration form about the toolkit, so it's very easy to find. You just Google AAUW DEI Toolkit. It's the first thing that's going to pop up in terms of your search results. You click on that and you get access to a bunch of resources that have been prepared by the Inclusion and Equity Committee, including a lot of branch programming. There'll be a link to what's called the plug and play programs, and those are actually programs that are set up to allow you to have a program at your branch. So please do, there's a ton of information, there's branch programming, there's just a ton of really great information on that toolkit, so please do check that out. A little bit of housekeeping, we will preserve time at the end for questions, so please do use that Q&A feature to ask questions of Melissa and or Jessica or me if you want to hear from me on anything. And with that, I think I will turn it over to Melissa. Dr. LeDuc, please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shannon. And again, thanks for everyone who is attending. This is a little different than some of our past inclusion equity webinars, but we really think it's important to highlight, the origins of AAUW and the changes that were made along the way, both structurally and the key people that helped make us who we are today. And our goal is by looking at where we started, and we can better see where we're going, right? And we're at a pivotal point in AAUW that we can make history with some of the changes that are being presented in this next election. So with that, Jessica, let's start at the beginning. Please share.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Jessica. It's very wonderful to see so many people interested in the work I do at the National Office and interested in the history of AAUW. It has been the highlight of my career to work with these archives, and I'm very excited to share some of the things in our collection that can help everyone learn about our organization, how AAUW has functioned for 142 years, and some of the very special people that we've been connected to. I think often with the history of AAUW, we tend to focus on the big issues that we advocated for, but today we're going to focus on us, right? The American Association of University Women, how we've changed as an organization since 1881, and who was with us as we did that, and who kind of inspired these changes. Because there's been a lot. It's been a century and a half. The world is very different since 1881 and 2024. A couple of the obvious ones, we changed our name back in the early 1920s. We were originally the Association of Collegiate Alumni. And then when we merged with a few other organizations across the country, we came up with the name American Association of University Women. We also changed our headquarters. Our original headquarters was a wooden trunk in Boston, Massachusetts that would get passed from president to president. And as we grew, we eventually moved to Washington, D.C., and we now have a big office building. We don't exactly work out of a wooden trunk anymore. And we have changed our bylaws every year or every 2 years at our national convention, pretty much since the beginning of the organization. All the way back in 1881, our original founders had a lot of decisions to make. They debated a handful of different things. They discussed them ad nauseum. I have the minutes in our collection. They had to do things like define what an institution is. Is it a college? Is it a university? Is it a prep school? What tells us that it's a prep school or a trade school or things of that nature? They also debated and discussed who would be a member of this organization, what our objectives were, what our priorities would be. Originally, to be a member of AAUW, it was for any woman who has received a higher degree in arts, philosophy, science, or literature from any college that had been unanimously approved by the executive committee. And that's what made you eligible, and then an individual would have to apply. Each individual college also had to apply, and that application would be presented to the executive committee, and they would have to be in complete agreement. The executive committee spent a lot of time and energy debating and deciding these things of what made an eligible institution. What about the curriculum? How many people worked there? How many women were in positions of leadership? It was things like this, and they would sit together and review all of these applications. I can only imagine how painstaking it was. But it was important work because it was work that hadn't been done before. Now, a lot of these decisions were not unanimous. In the minutes of these original meetings, we see that many people wanted their opinion on the record, especially if they didn't agree. People like Ellen Amanda Hayes, she was of Oberlin University. She's one of our original founders. And she ended up working a lot of her career at Wesley College. And in the history of Wesley College, they describe her as, quote, a dauntless radical all her days. In the 80s, she was wearing short skirts. In the 90s, she was a staunch advocate for women's suffrage, and in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, an ardent socialist. After her retirement and until her death in 1930, she was actively connected with an experiment in adult education for working girls. I just think she is a great example of the kind of women that we're talking about at the founding of our organization. She was highly intelligent, active in her community, passionate about equity, and heart set on making change for her fellow women. But when deciding on the requirements for membership, she wasn't exactly in agreement with everyone else. She went on the record in the minutes saying that she believed such a society must be of advantage, but was doubtful whether the restrictions to admission to that society would be for the best. And I find it very impressive that this idea is still relevant and relatable today. She had quite an insight, I think, seeing as how we've been talking about this for over a century. And after that first year, a lot of the things that they decided changed kind of rapidly. The unanimous approval of universities was very quickly changed to a 3/4 majority because it was becoming very difficult to get universities approved and into our approved membership list. Additionally, in 1887, we implemented a $1 annual membership fee. And we started awarding fellowships in 1888. We decided that raising money and giving money to women to further that education was one of the priorities of the institution. So the first fellowship is in 1888, and then our first international fellowship is in 1917. That's when we start to see the organization really have an interest in international work, and then especially international education. And speaking of international work, we have, of course, Marie Curie is a very well-known kind of faces of AAUW. However, it's a common misconception. I hear this a lot, that people assume that she was one of our international fellows, but that wasn't quite the case. She was educated around the time, actually, that we organized the organization. So Marie Curie was a Polish-French physicist and chemist who was awarded 2 Nobel Prizes for her work with radium. In 1891, Curie left Poland to attend university in Paris, largely due to the influence of the Russian occupation in Poland, and especially the influence that it was having on education, on the education of the Polish language, on women in Poland. So she and her sister leave and move to Paris, France. There, she was educated in physics and mathematical science, and she very quickly became the director of the physics laboratory at her university and completed her doctorate by 1903, which is the same year that she won a Nobel Prize, which is rather impressive. If I had won a Nobel Prize coming out of graduate school, I think I probably would have retired at that point. Marie Curie believed that radium could alleviate suffering during times of war. So when the First World War began, she paused all of her research, all of the things she was doing to advance her knowledge to join the war effort. But when the war ended, she didn't have very much radium left, and she didn't have very much money to purchase more radium, as it being post-war France. And so all she could really do was continue the work that she was doing to help people with sickness and injuries, all the work that she had been doing with radium, but she couldn't continue to further her knowledge or further any of her research. And so AAUW joined a national campaign to raise funds to help Marie Curie purchase more radium, and we raised over $150,000, and that's in the 1920s. So we really raised a lot of money for her. And she actually came to the United States for a visit, and we presented the funds to her during a ceremony at Carnegie Hall. It was a very special connection for AAUW. We still have the original thank you notes that she sent us in our archival collection. And I believe it was 2 years ago that Gloria spoke at the French Embassy for the anniversary of her institute. Now, all of this money after Marie Curie's death was passed on to her daughter, who continued the same work. And eventually the excess funds, her daughter passes away, there isn't another person to kind of turn it over to. And so all of those funds were returned to AAUW, where we were able to use that money towards another fellowship in Marie Curie's name in order to support American and French women studying chemistry, physics, or radiology. So she isn't quite an international fellow, but she is responsible for a handful of our international fellows. Now, the interesting part is that despite all of Marie Curie's accomplishments, she was not eligible for AAUW membership. At the time, we didn't have any foreign universities on our approved university list. That wouldn't come until 1921. And we amended the bylaws to include foreign universities that had been approved by the International Federation of University Women, an international organization that we had a very close relationship with. I think that perhaps our work with Marie Curie started to have us realize how many brilliant minds were kind of all over the world, and that it would be beneficial for us to have some of those individuals as members. But either way, that was kind of our first step towards changing what the membership looked like and kind of creating the organization that we know today. Now, we have had a handful of funds over the years that have been named after specific individuals who are connected with AAUW. We had the Judith Resnick Fund, for example. She was an American fellow. She came to us during graduate school, and she received an American fellowship. And then, of course, she went on to have an incredible career. She became the second woman in space. And after her death in the Challenger explosion, we started a fund in her memory. Many of you may be familiar with the Eleanor Roosevelt Fund, which we established in 1988. It was named in honor of our relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt. That was very important to the board and to kind of keep with her priorities, the things that were important to her. So it was a fund that largely focused on teachers, providing funding for teachers to take sabbaticals or to continue their education, as well as school programs. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt was, of course, the First Lady of the United States. She was also the First Lady of New York. She was a diplomat, an activist, and she was a member of AAUW. She worked with us for years on many different issues, and she even attended our national conference in 1959, and she spoke to the entire conference. I believe she was our keynote speaker. However, Eleanor Roosevelt did not, and still would not, qualify to be a member, or a regular member, I should say, of AAUW. She did not have a degree. She did not even attend college. Her highest level of education was attending a private boarding school, so kind of the equivalent of a high school level education. And she spoke very often about education in her lifetime. And one of the things that she consistently said was that continuing her education was one of her biggest regrets. She had all these accomplishments, but she always regretted not going to college. But it kind of begs the question, how did she become a member if she didn't have a degree from the approved list? In 1929, we amended the bylaws to allow what we called honorary members, and they were allowed at the branch level under associate memberships. At the time, Eleanor Roosevelt was the First Lady of New York, and so she was invited to join the New York branch. And the only requirement for associate memberships were that the total number of honorary members did not exceed 20% of the total branch membership. So you didn't have to have a certain position, you didn't have to be a person of note, it just was about a numbers thing. You could invite any person to be an honorary member. She eventually, Eleanor Roosevelt, gets awarded an honorary degree, which was also another way that individuals could join AAUW after, I believe, 1933. But in this case, she was invited because of her status as the governor's wife. So the bylaws, of course, are a very important part of how we operate and the kind of rules that we have to operate within. But like a lot of things, as we can see, there's wiggle room, right? We just talked about a member who didn't have the education required to be a member, and yet she was one. And I'd argue having Eleanor Roosevelt join AAUW was absolutely a net positive. However, the said wiggle room that we talk about can also be used negatively. While our bylaws clearly define, or defined back then, what one person needed in order to become a member, they did not specify that you were guaranteed membership if you met those requirements. It was a known issue. It was something that people were often talking about, and especially after World War II, as you see the civil rights movement growing, it becomes more and more of an issue that has to be addressed. This is just a small note. This is a big topic, so I'll be covering a couple decades. I'll do my best to summarize everything, but I definitely encourage you to look into this time period more because there is a lot happening depending on where in the country a branch is located or who's writing in, and there's a president change and all that stuff. So if you think I'm leaving out any important details, I apologize. But in the 1930s and 40s, most branches required new members to be recommended by a current member who was in good standing. This was not in the bylaws. This was something that requirements that branches could have for their own membership. And it was also very common to require a site visit. So current members would visit a prospective member's home, kind of in ways as a welcoming committee, and in other ways to guarantee that they were kind of an upstanding citizen. It was a way to kind of look around and make sure that they thought this member would fit within their branch. Susan Levine writes in her book titled Degrees of Equality, she said, quote, "Despite AAUW's principle of non-discrimination, embodied in the myriad of study programs, legislative actions, and educational reforms promoted by the association headquarters, the social reality of most branches remained racially and socially homogeneous." So in 1938, the IFUW, the International Federation of University Women, who were very closely connected with at the time, they added a non-discrimination policy to their constitution to kind of get past any kind of behavior like this. Despite AAUW lobbying against that change to their constitution, and after it passed, they pressured their affiliates to do the same. They said, listen, we have to have this in writing. And a lot of their affiliates left, especially their European affiliates, Italy, I believe Germany. AAUW stayed, but it did create tension. And they were putting a lot of pressure on us to put this in writing as well. Then the Second World War starts and, they have different priorities. But shortly after the Second World War begins, AAUW begins raising money for what we called the War Relief Fund. So what we did was we wanted to assist European scholars and university women who were displaced by military occupation and could no longer continue their work. The United States wasn't accepting refugees yet, so we kind of stepped in and did what we could. The War Relief Committee worked absolutely tirelessly. They were trying to find teaching positions for these women to get their immigration sponsored at American schools and university. We drew on every connection that we had in the academic community. Individual AAUW branch members participated by signing immigration affidavits of support. And in just the first year, we raised almost $30,000 from about 350 branches contributing to the fund. And this effort provided assistance to many women. 3 of those women came to us recommended by Albert Einstein himself. He sent us letters saying, this person is an incredible scientist and we have to help her get out of Eastern Europe if you can help. And in the end, this fund ended up saving the lives of about 150 Eastern European women. It's about 150 women who end up getting appointments at American universities directly through AAUW. It's a really, really impressive thing. It's also a very interesting dichotomy because we are working tirelessly to help in any way that the organization can to spare these people the discrimination that Nazi forces are imposing in Eastern Europe. But at the same time, we're not taking the action to ensure that those same women are welcomed into our organization at every level without discrimination. And after the war, it starts really becoming an issue. So much so that the AAUW president at the time, Catherine McHale, she estimated that only 7 branches out of all of our branches had non-white members. And when she was asked about it, she would encourage women of color to join as national members in order to avoid the issue of branch integration. Even saying to one branch president, quote, fortunately, no one has pressed the idea of branch membership, and naturally, I do not care for the issue to arise. But while some AAUW leaders are avoiding the conversation, others are expressing the need to confront it. Alice Mead, she was a member and a former branch president from Flint, Michigan. She told McHale, quote, AAUW does not lack the courage, which should be part of our training as educated women. We are permitting the social aspects of our organization to overshadow its fundamental objectives. So while we're having this conversation, different people are writing in asking for advice. It's happening all over the country. There are so many letters of McHale responding to branch members, presidents. The IFUW is putting a lot of pressure on us. Other like-minded organizations in the US are putting pressure on us. And before we can really do very much at the board level or at the convention, the topic can't be avoided any longer when a Black woman, Mary Church Terrell, reapplied to the DC branch of AAUW for membership. And the branch board unanimously rejected her application. Mary Church Terrell was a very accomplished woman. She was an American educator. She was an activist, a leader. She was also a member of AAUW in the early 1900s, but she had let her membership, she had kind of left it for a little while as she focused on other activities. But then on October 8th, 1946, Mrs. Terrell applied at the DC branch office for reinstatement in the branch and paid a year's dues. Her former membership was vouched for. They were one of the branches that you had to be recommended by, and she was vouched for by one of the oldest and most respected members of the branch. Her name was Mrs. Clarence F. Swift, and she had been a member of AAUW since 1884. So she was quite the established member. However, her application, Terrell's application, was still rejected. Eventually, the branch ends up holding a referendum to allow the membership to decide if they would like to integrate or not. And the vote was split 250 for integration and 350 against integration. Now, while the national requirement for membership was an approved degree from an approved institution, the bylaws did not specify that a branch wasn't allowed to refuse members based on other criteria. which was upheld by a DC court because of the language of the bylaws. They weren't in violation of the bylaws, technically speaking. However, despite this setback in inclusion at the branch level, it did mobilize our membership to overwhelmingly support amending the bylaws at the 1949 National Convention, and we reaffirmed our membership requirement. And so within the bylaws, we added, after all the requirements of membership, we added, quote, "The provisions set forth in this section are the sole requirements of eligibility and admissibility for membership, both in the National Association and in a branch." Mary Church Terrell continued her activism for her entire life. She wrote multiple books. She was involved in the lawsuit that led to the desegregation of DC restaurants, and she advocated for the desegregation of schools. And she actually lived to see the Supreme Court announce their decision in Board versus Education. She died very shortly after that. But she had an incredible career. She's a very interesting person. And years later, the DC branch started a foundation in her honor to help young women in Washington, DC find a pathway out of poverty. So a very special way to remember Mary Church Terrell. So at this point, we're in the late 40s, early 50s, and we've added non-discrimination language to the bylaws when it comes to members, but we are still very, very strict with universities. I brought it up briefly earlier, but this was a very important aspect of AAUW membership for over 80 years, which university you attended. Having a degree was not enough. It had to be from a specific university, and oftentimes it had to be a specific degree. Each university had to apply, and AAUW would publish a pamphlet every 2 years that outlined which schools and which degrees at those schools qualified for membership. For example, it would say Florida State University, Tallahassee, bachelor's degrees from the College of Arts and Science, the School of Education, or in nursing or communications are eligible for membership. Everything else, not eligible. And it would be common to see universities be revoked. A lot of times in the pamphlet, it would say, and a Bachelor of Science in nursing from 1941 to 1947. You had to graduate within that time frame. And if it was before or after, you didn't qualify for membership. It was a very lengthy application process. It included site visits, evaluations. They wanted to see specific records depending on which university it was, things of that nature. And oftentimes universities were not approved. This was not a formality. Instead, they would have to reapply, right? They could make changes. They would be invited to come back however many years later. We would give them feedback saying, these are the reasons why you weren't eligible, why we didn't approve your application. And then even if they were approved, they would have follow-ups, reevaluations. We were very involved at the university level. And the criteria was robust. You had to have enough women in certain positions. Enough women had to have tenure. They would sometimes look at academic criteria. They would want to look at syllabi for certain programs, things of this nature, and it would be different with each university. Now, as far as I have found in our collection, a historically Black college or university was not found eligible for membership until we changed that policy in 1963. For example, Howard University, right in the national office's neighborhood, they inquired multiple times and they submitted at least one application to join AAUW as a membership eligible institution in 1950. So after performing a site visit in 1952, I think that kind of tells you how robust the application process was, that it took 2 years to get the site visit. AAUW informed Howard University that due to concerns about the status of the Dean of Women at the university, approval would be postponed, and they would be welcome to apply again if there was a change to the status of the Dean of Women. Now, while the intentions of these requirements may not be exclusionary, site visits, applications, references, it's all very common. However, it can be used as exclusionary tools, which is what made this change all the more important for creating an inclusive AAUW. Lengthy application, they cost universities time, money, staffing that they may not have. Even if they feel that membership to AAUW would be very beneficial for their graduates, it just may not be possible. But in 1963, the entire process ended. We amended the bylaws to accept degrees from any nationally accredited college or university who requested to be on our list, making AAUW's membership significantly more inclusive especially for these smaller universities, maybe in smaller parts of the country or more rural areas that didn't quite have the time or the staffing to go through the application process. Now, we've spent most of the time I was talking about women, which makes a lot of sense because the W in AAUW stands for women. However, men are also members of AAUW. Since 1987, our bylaws have been amended to read any individual instead of any woman. And the topic of bringing men into our membership first appeared in 1979 at the convention, and it did not pass. Afterwards, the AAUW Journal said, quote, "The convention voted that AAUW will remain a single-sex organization until society is ready to grant women equality." It's not an unfair statement. However, 8 years later, AAUW members voted again, and they amended the bylaws to indicate it was said, quote, "indicate that we are not a discriminatory organization. Our mission statement and purpose will not change if men are allowed to become members." And I think that's a really important quote to remember. Changing who joins our membership does not change the work that our organization does. Any of these changes did not change the work that we were doing outside of AAUW, what we were advocating for, or what our priorities were. But this specific change led to the first United States president joining our ranks and making a presidential appearance at the AAUW National Convention. The freshly inaugurated George H.W. Bush gave a speech at our 1989 convention where he proudly referred to himself as the first AAUW member to become president of the United States. I think it's a really good example of how excited some men were to be able to join our mission and what we were doing at AAUW. I like to think that Albert Einstein would have become a member after working with us with all that war relief and continued his relationship with us, but of course he couldn't back then. So as we kind of wrap up, I wanted to sort of hone in on that degree requirement aspect. We didn't cover it earlier, but I think it's important to know that a bachelor's degree wasn't added until 1961. You had to have a higher degree, so master's, doctorate. And in just reviewing on our website, the faces of AAUW, you'll come across a handful of women who only have a bachelor's degree. A great example is Lou Henry Hoover. She was the 31st First Lady of the United States. She was the first woman to receive a bachelor's degree in geology at Stanford. She was also the president of the Girl Scouts of America, and it's under her leadership that we get Girl Scout cookies, so that's pretty great. But she didn't qualify for membership in AAUW in our lifetime, even though we worked very closely with her and we worked very closely with the Girl Scouts of America. She could have never, except as an honorary member, of course, but she couldn't just typically, as a typical member would, join AAUW. Other women, Nancy Pelosi, she wouldn't have been able to be a member until 1961. We've worked very closely with her. Gloria Steinman. And still to this day, our friend Lilly Ledbetter does not qualify for membership. If you don't remember, when Lilly Ledbetter realized that she had been left a note on her desk that she was making significantly less than her male counterparts at Goodyear Tire. She was a tire room manager, and the other people who held her position were men, and they made significantly more than her. It went to court, and eventually it went to the Supreme Court, and it did not go her way. And she describes herself as becoming the poster child for unequal pay. After this Supreme Court decision, she didn't want to take the decision quietly. So she reached out to organizations like ours. We worked very closely with Lilly Ledbetter, and we advocated alongside her until the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act was passed in 2009. It was Obama's first piece of legislation, and we were right there with her as he signed it. And right after that ceremony of him signing that legislation, she got on a plane and flew to New Jersey to speak at an AAUW event. So clearly it's a relationship that she was very proud of and that we are very proud of. However, like Eleanor Roosevelt, Ledbetter didn't attend college, and if not for the honorary degrees that she received after becoming the quote poster child for unequal pay, she couldn't be a member of our organization. It was around this time, 2005, that AAUW voted to add the associate's degree to our membership requirement. So now technical universities, anywhere that offers an associate's degree, or anyone with associate's degrees can join AAUW. But I hope that what you can kind of see through some of these stories is that AAUW has spent 142 years advocating, but also changing and shifting and realigning how it is that our organization works. We've changed our minds, we've changed our rules, our requirements many times. And personally, especially in my line of work, I hope that we continue to change and kind of meet the world where they're at.
Thank you so much for that,
Of course.
all of that amazing information. I found a couple things really interesting before we open up to more Q&A. And thanks for folks that are posting questions and comments in the chat as we go. So you mentioned that the war relief effort focused a lot on finding teaching positions. Now, considering in 1886, teaching degrees were not considered for membership. Why do you think that shift in AAUW happened, or when did it happen? Sorry, missed that.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So I think a lot of that comes from how robust our application process was for universities, that we did have a very positive relationship with universities. So it was easy for us to make those kind of academic connections. I also think it comes a lot from how subjects or majors are defined. For instance, all the way back in the early days, in the 1800s, if you were studying physics, I assumed that was a science degree. It was actually a philosophy degree back then, right? So as we kind of start to open up, and then it depends a lot on the university. So Columbia Teaching School of Education, Columbia School of Education, I believe, they're one of the early education schools to be allowed into membership. But you don't see it with every university, right? A big thing that they were trying to avoid was allowing like a prep school in. They didn't want women being at like finishing schools becoming members or things like that. And I think kind of the education path could cross over with that. So as those two things start to separate, I think we kind of start to separate it as well.
So, and you talk a lot about the site visits and the application process and like all this criteria that a university would have to meet in order to join AAUW. Is there, or in any of your research, did you find what criteria they were looking for, or what weighted more heavily in their consideration?
Oh, yes. A lot of it, a big part of the focus was women in positions of leadership, power, academia, seeing that women were either the head of a department. Like typically what I would see is if a university only was approved for certain subjects, a woman would be the head of that department, because that was very important. They didn't want universities that all men were instructing and it was the only women in the building were students. They wanted to know that there were people there advocating for women. And then the other thing they wanted to see was that it was part of the university's mission, right? They wanted to see that uplifting women was not against, I don't know how long it takes Harvard University. It's probably not until 1963, right? But they famously don't allow women for the longest time, and they have a separate university for women. That was never going to pass, those original application processes. They wanted to see that it was part of the university's priority to have women there, to have women doing research, and to have women learning.
Well, that's awesome. And then with those schools like Harvard's that didn't allow women in for the longest time, and this may be me being ignorant, but if they are not necessarily allowing women in, then my assumption is that a lot of their faculty is also not women, right? So with the faculty, needing to be women and that criteria being weighted higher, what was that disconnect, or did the criteria then change based on these schools slowly evolving?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of, like, especially if you think about Harvard or Yale or these older schools, they don't change until well after we change. Like, I don't think that Harvard admitted women until like the 70s. So that's kind of long after we're doing this application process. I think a big change for us is the advent of national accreditation. Once we kind of have that body that we can rely on, I also think it took a ton of time and a ton of effort to do that. And it probably took away from a lot of the things that we could do externally. So there kind of might have been a little bit of a compromise of like, well, there's another body that's regulating this. They might not be regulating it the way that we would, but we can take all this energy and put it elsewhere, and kind of what's more valuable to us, like being on top of these universities or being able to put our efforts elsewhere.
Yeah. You mentioned a powerful quote, and it was the social aspect of AAUW was overshadowing the primary mission. In your opinion, where in AAUW history has that quote or that sentiment kind of emerged or reemerged?
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, definitely at that time, I would say when it comes to the discussion of non-discrimination language, I think everyone was it was very important to branches, the social aspect of it. And everyone was very nervous about requiring to make a branch do something and that they might kind of leave. And I think you can see that through the years. You can always kind of look to what National is doing, what the different priorities of the organization are. And then you don't see every single branch coming up behind each fund, right? We have the Coretta Scott King Fund, and a lot of branches refuse to participate with it. The Marie Curie Fund, I'm sure a bunch of branches didn't participate with it, but you kind of see it consistently where you can participate if your branch wants to, or if it doesn't. And I imagine there was probably, especially back then, a lot of kind of voting at the branch level of if everyone wanted to do it or things like that. The thing about the records that I have in the collection is we don't hold a lot of branch records, so it's difficult to know what each branch's priorities were at that time, because typically it's a branch's responsibility to hang on to their records. We have a few things, especially from the early years. But there's definitely kind of a disconnect there. And especially in the early days, it was having site visits and things like that, you can tell it's very important who is in the group and how important the social aspect of it is. And kind of forcing them to accept people was not something that they were very interested in doing.
So I'm now going to pull some of the questions from the chat. And one that is up here that I think you briefly touched on from Suzanne Rothwell is, to what extent were Jewish persons excluded and when were they admitted to membership?
So I think that's a really great question. And I think it's a really important thing to think about when we're talking about the whole non-discrimination language being added into the bylaws. I think a lot of that time, it was about Black women. right? But we can't forget the other people who would be excluded based on where we were, right? In the Southwest, it would be Mexican American women. In California, it would be Asian American women, right? During the Second World War, it would be Japanese American women. I would say that it would be Jewish American women probably in most sections of the country, depending on the community, depending on the social aspect of the branch. And all of that would change for everyone when we add the non-discrimination language. Now, what someone's interest in joining that branch might be based on how everyone acts in that community might dictate whether Jewish women felt safe joining the branch, or, it would kind of depend on each location. But once we add that to the bylaws, they can no longer reject applications of individuals who have the proper degree that qualifies for membership.
So with the application for membership from universities and being so daunting to some, right, especially those smaller schools, Kate asks, why were universities eager to be approved by AAUW?
That's a great question. I think in some ways it would be different for each university. I also think, we have to kind of put ourselves in the mindset of the 1940s, the 1950s. All the information that you're getting is coming from organizations like ours, right? We're putting out the AAUW journal every other month for years. So those they're going to get promotion through us, right? It might help someone decide which university they want to go to. If it grants membership, it might make the degree seem more elite or things like that. It kind of adds to the whole community. And then it has them involved with us where, we're at the same time that all of this is happening, we're advocating for Title IX. We're advocating for, all these, our name is in politics. And so I think a positive relationship with us, and then having something that you can give to your member or to your graduates at the end of it is, you now qualify for this. And I think that's the kind of large and small of it, is it would be different for each university, but it's also, there's no website for your university. There's no, we're the ones kind of holding all that information. If you're an 18-year-old woman thinking about going to school, you might just pick up one of our pamphlets and see a list of school and apply to those ones. You might not know about every single school in a certain area or region. So it was almost marketing, I suppose, like early 1900s marketing.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. And then with some of that marketing and some of the changes, can you clarify that the change that happened in 1961 to allow bachelor's degrees?
Yes. Yeah. So prior to 1961, it would have read, I don't have it in front of me, but it would have read something along the lines of, any woman with a higher degree or a master's or doctorate degree from a qualified university or institution X, Y, and Z. And then in 1961, they changed it to say any woman with a bachelor's degree or higher. So prior to that, you had to have a graduate level degree or a doctorate in order to be a member. And then they open it up to bachelor's degrees. So anyone at that level now qualifies.
Yeah. And then for a bachelor's degree, it didn't matter if it was a Bachelor of Arts or a Bachelor of Science, just any bachelor's.
Correct. Yeah. At that point, early on, we're very specific about philosophy, literature, science. And then that all kind of starts to dissipate the more universities are on our list and where we're delineating what majors at that university. And then kind of as that all chips away, it just becomes the degree level. So by 61, we're about to change the university requirement, but it would be a bachelor's degree at a qualifying institution. So it would have to be, if it was the Florida State University, a bachelor's degree in nursing, whereas prior it might have been a doctorate degree in this certain department or master's.
Awesome. So with those changes in membership criteria and university membership criteria, how did the mission statement evolve? Yeah.
It's such a great question. I get this one a lot. I've gotten it a lot almost my whole time with AAUW. And I don't know if anyone else would ever be interested in looking into it, but mission statements are a thing of the 70s. We don't really write an official mission statement until about the 1970s. You can kind of glean from what we write in the bylaws and different things of what our objectives are, but we don't ever formally write like one sentence and call it our mission statement until the 70s. It's also around that time that you start to see our focus on the word equity. Prior to that, we're focused on creating opportunities, right? Because you have to remember in 1881, these women are some of the first women to hold higher degrees in this country. So their priority is to get more women that opportunity. And then as that becomes more realistic, that's when we kind of keep shifting all these years as things change. And it's around the 70s that we start to see the word equity showing up, and that's becomes a very important thing to us. It's not only about opportunity. We also are starting to say we want equity in pay, we want equity in treatment, we want equity in education. We don't want to just be pushing, we don't want to just be advancing, because now we've advanced and we're here and we want to be treated fairly, because look at what we've done. So the mission definitely changes. I think as women advance, right? As we have wins, as things change, we change our priorities. I would say on average, every like 5 to 6 years, we're kind of rewriting that and tinkering with what our objectives are.
Awesome. And with that tinkering, Marilyn asks, what was the membership category that was discontinued in the 1950s? Do you know offhand?
The membership category that was discontinued in the 1950s. I would assume that there was a change to what the definition of associate membership was, or perhaps associate membership was slightly discontinued for a time. Because I know now it's very different, right? We have student memberships, we're kind of always changing that. But I would assume, yeah, I would assume that it was an alteration to associate memberships or affiliate memberships, or you know, kind of the different categories that we put into associate members. You know, we could have, I'm trying to think, we've had honorary degrees since about the 30s. So it could have been something along those lines where we said, you know, this kind of like one thing is no longer, and we switched it to something else. But nothing like jumps out at me from the 50s. If I think of it, I will come back to you.
Awesome, thank you. In some of those changes, Carolyn notes that in her old branch meeting minutes, there was a requirement to physically see the diploma of members. When did that change in AAUW?
That would be at the branch level. So we never, well, I shouldn't say we never. I imagine there was a time that you had to submit some kind of paperwork proving that you went to university along with your application. But my assumption would be that you could mail in a copy. I don't know that you always had to send an official, you know, what the application requirements were. But then that would largely be based on the branch's requirements, because branches could have their own requirements for members. So one specific branch could say, you have to bring your diploma into this office. Another branch could say a picture on your phone is completely acceptable. Just like the reference, just like how some members wanted to have, or some branches wanted to have new members be vouched for by a current standing member. That was not every branch in the country. That was just specific branches who that was important to.
And one last question. Thank you so much. If
course.
anyone is interested in learning more about any of the topics that you discussed, where would you direct them?
Everywhere. No, so there are a couple great books. Marion Talbot wrote, who was our first president. She wrote a book about the first about 40 years of the organization. That's a great, if you're interested in those early days, I mean, she was the one there, and she kind of gives you her whole account of everything that happened. There's also a great book, I referenced it earlier, by Susan Levine. I believe it came out in about 2000, maybe 2010. It's called Degrees of Equality, and it's actually mostly about AAUW and other feminist organizations at the time. She is a very interesting book. She does a very good job. She spent a lot of time in our archives. That's very clear because almost all of her citations are from different boxes and folders that I have. Additionally, if there are specific things you want to learn about, or if you want to learn about, if you have questions about maintaining your own archives, you can always reach out to me. I talk to branches and give them advice on maintaining their own archives all the time. And a lot of times branches will retire their records to their local university or library. So if you look in your community, you might be able to find a collection of your branch's records, either at a university, a historic society, a library. It might not be everything, because I know that it kind of is an ebb and a flow, but a lot of our branches have donated their archives places.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I know we've got a minute left, so Shannon, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you so much to Jessica. What a tremendous program tonight. I think we all learned a lot. I know I did. And this is just such great context for every AUW member, I think, to just consider, but particularly as I think as many of our members know, we're going into a vote that will start in early April on open membership and changing our changing our membership requirement. This is another point in time where that could happen. So definitely to all the folks who are on tonight, look forward to another webinar that will be co-hosted by the Open Membership Task Force and the Inclusion and Equity Committee in early April. You'll get some information on that in the coming weeks as we get a little bit closer to that. But thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. Thank you so much to Jessica and Melissa. And please do, to all of you who joined us, please leave some survey results. You get a little survey pop-up at the end of this webinar, and that really helps us understand what kind of content, how you like the webinar, first of all, and then second of all, what kind of content you would like to see in future webinars. So with that, I will wish you all a very good evening, and thank you so much for joining us. Good night, everyone.